There are secrets that governments bury in vaults. There are secrets that disappear into fire, into shredded paper, into the silence of men who know better than to speak. And then there are secrets of a different kind, secrets so dangerous that the state doesn't destroy them, it keeps them, locked away, catalogued, preserved with the same meticulous care it gives to weapons treaties and military codes. Because destroying a secret leaves a gap, and gaps invite questions. But an archive that no one is allowed to open, that is something else. That is controlled silence. That is power. This is a story about one of those secrets, and it begins not with a conspiracy, not with a murder, not with a war, but with a woman sitting alone in a reading room, turning the pages of documents that no one expected her to find. Her name was Anna. She was 62 years old. She had spent her entire adult life as a revolutionary, a Bolshevik, a true believer. She had been arrested by the Tsar's police, exiled to Siberia, and had returned to fight again. She had watched her younger brother rise from a provincial lawyer to the leader of the first socialist state in human history. She had buried him in January of 1924, and now, months after his death, the party had given her a task that seemed, on the surface, almost administrative. Document the family, write the genealogy, give the Soviet people a proper account of where Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov came from. It seemed like an act of reverence. It was, in fact, the beginning of a crisis that would last 60 years. To understand why, you have to understand what January 1924 meant. Lenin was dead. The embalmers were only just beginning their work. The mausoleum on Red Square was still a sketch on an architect's table. But the political machinery of myth-making was already running at full speed. The Communist Party needed Lenin not just as a man who had died, but as a symbol that could not die. A founding father, a secular saint, an icon in the most literal sense, an image to be venerated, reproduced, placed on walls, carried in processions. The cult of Lenin was not something that emerged gradually. It was a deliberate political construction, assembled in the weeks and months after his death, with the same cold calculation that Lenin himself had applied to everything else. In that context, genealogy was not a neutral exercise. It was a political act. Who Lenin was, where he came from, what blood ran in his veins, what his family had been before the revolution, all of that fed directly into the image the party was building. The official story was simple and clean. Lenin was Russian. He came from the educated middle class, the intelligentsia, the kind of family that produced teachers and civil servants, and occasionally revolutionaries. His father had been a school inspector. His mother had been a devoted, cultured woman. The family was respectable, serious, and thoroughly Russian. That was the story. That was what the party needed the story to be. Anna Ulyanova-Elizarova, his older sister, was given the task of confirming it. She went to the archives. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was one of the qualities that had made her a capable revolutionary and a careful editor. She worked through church records, through the registers of the Tsarist Ministry of Internal Affairs, through the kind of administrative paperwork that empires generate in enormous quantities and rarely think to hide, because no one imagines that the paperwork will ever matter. She was looking for the family of her mother, Maria Alexandrovna, born Blank. The Blank family. A doctor's family. Respectable, educated, assimilated. And then she found it. The document was not hidden. It was simply there, in the archive, the way inconvenient truths often are. Not buried, just unread. It concerned Maria's father, Alexander Dmitrievich Blank, the man Anna had known as her maternal grandfather. A physician, a man of standing, a Christian. Except that before he was Alexander, he had been Israel Moiseyevich Blank. And before he was a Christian, he had been Jewish. The grandfather of Vladimir Lenin, the man whose blood ran through the founder of the Soviet state, had been born into a Jewish family in the Russian Empire, in an era when that meant living within the pale of settlement, subject to legal restrictions that governed where you could live, what you could do, how far you could rise. He had converted to Orthodox Christianity as a young man, taken a Russian name, built a career as a physician, married a woman of German and Swedish descent, and raised children who, by all appearances and by their own understanding, were simply Russian. The conversion had worked. The assimilation had succeeded. The past had been closed. But archives don't forget. The Tsarist bureaucracy had recorded everything: the original name, the conversion, the paperwork of a life reinvented. And now Anna Ulyanova was holding that paperwork in her hands. She was not horrified. That is important to understand. Anna was a Bolshevik. She believed in internationalism. She believed that nationality was a bourgeois construct, that the revolution had swept away the old hierarchies of blood and faith and ethnicity. She did not see her discovery as a scandal. She saw it as something more interesting, as evidence of the very complexity that the revolution was supposed to celebrate. Her brother had not been purely Russian. He had been something richer, more layered, more human than the icon the party was already building. But Anna was also a political animal. She had survived decades of underground work. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent years calculating risk, exactly what this discovery meant in the world as it actually existed in 1924. This was not a world of pure Bolshevik idealism. This was a world in which white émigré pamphlets were already circulating across Europe, claiming that the Russian Revolution had been a Jewish conspiracy. A world in which anti-Semitism was not a relic of the Tsarist past, but a living, breathing political force. A world in which the enemies of the Soviet state would take this information and use it as a weapon. She understood all of that, and she decided to write to Stalin anyway. Because here is what made Anna Ulyanova remarkable, and what made her situation genuinely tragic. She believed that the truth, properly framed, was more powerful than the lie. She believed that Lenin's mixed heritage, Jewish, German, Swedish, Russian, and possibly more, as she would later argue, was not a vulnerability. It was an argument, it was proof, written in blood and bone, that the revolution belonged to everyone. That the man who had led it was not the property of any single nation or ethnicity. That the internationalism Lenin had preached was not just a political position, but something he had carried in his own body without even knowing it. She sat down and wrote her first letter to Stalin. She laid out what she had found. She made her case. She was careful, precise, and completely sincere. She was also, as events would prove, completely wrong about how Stalin would respond. But that letter, and what happened after it, is where this story truly begins. Because the question of what Stalin did with Anna's discovery tells us something not just about Lenin, not just about Soviet politics, but about the nature of myth itself. About what happens when a state decides that a man must be more than a man. About the price of turning a human being into a symbol. The documents Anna found were real. Historians who later examined them, after the Soviet archives began to open in the late 1980s, confirmed their authenticity. Israel Blank had existed. The conversion had happened. The genealogy was what it was. What became the subject of a 60-year silence, enforced at the highest levels of the Soviet state, was whether any of it should be allowed to matter. And that question is far more interesting than the genealogy itself, because it forces us to ask, what exactly were they protecting? Not Lenin, he was dead. Not the revolution, it had already survived civil war, famine, and foreign intervention. What they were protecting was the story, the clean, simple, politically useful story of a man who had come from nowhere in particular and changed everything. A man who belonged to everyone because he belonged to no one specific. That story was a lie. Not a malicious lie, perhaps. More of a simplification, a careful editing of messy human reality into something more manageable. But it was a lie that the Soviet state would guard, for decades, with a ferocity it rarely applied to actual state secrets. Anna Ulyanova found a name in a document. A name that had been changed, a faith that had been converted, a life rebuilt from the ground up. She thought she had found a footnote. She had actually found the beginning of a much longer story. A story about who Lenin really was, about where he actually came from, about the generations of people, Jewish merchants and freed serfs and German doctors' daughters and Kalmyk craftsmen, whose choices, whose conversions, whose migrations, whose marriages had quietly assembled across more than a century, the man who would one day stand before a crowd in Petrograd and announce that the world was about to change. That story is what we are going to tell. And it starts, as so many Russian stories do, with a document that someone very much wished had never been found. Anna Ulyanova was not a naive woman. She had spent the better part of her adult life navigating the gap between what was true and what was politically survivable. She had watched the revolution devour people who misjudged that gap. She knew the rules. And yet, when she sat down to write to Stalin, she chose to believe that the truth she had found was too important to bury. That belief would cost her more than she expected. The first letter was measured, careful, almost academic in its tone. She did not lead with the discovery itself, she led with the argument, the political case for why this information, handled correctly, could serve the revolution rather than damage it. She explained what the documents showed, that Lenin's maternal grandfather, Alexander Blank, had been born Israel Blank, the son of a Jewish family from the western provinces of the empire. That he had converted to Orthodox Christianity as a young man, built a career as a physician, and raised children who had no meaningful connection to the world he had left behind. That Lenin himself had almost certainly not known any of this. And then she made her case. In an era when the enemies of the Soviet state were spreading pamphlets across Europe claiming that Bolshevism was a Jewish conspiracy, the actual facts of Lenin's heritage were, she argued, a political weapon waiting to be used correctly. Not as a confession, not as an apology, but as a demonstration. Here was the founder of the Soviet state, a man who carried Jewish blood alongside German, Swedish, and Russian, and he had never known it, never traded on it, never used it. His internationalism had not been a pose. It had been, in some sense, written into him before he was born. She even reached back to something Lenin himself had said, in conversation with Maxim Gorky, about the shortage of what he called genuinely Russian people in the upper ranks of the party. It was a remark that had circulated quietly among those who had been present, and Anna cited it carefully, not as an embarrassment, but as evidence of Lenin's own unsentimental clarity about the complexity of Russian identity. That remark, she noted, had already been quietly removed from published accounts of the conversation. The editorial hand had been at work even before the ink on the hagiographies was dry. Stalin's response, when it came, was brief. The archives do not preserve the exact wording, but the substance is well documented by historians who later examined the correspondence. It amounted to 2 words in spirit, if not in letter. Not now. No explanation, no engagement with her argument, no acknowledgement that she had made a case worth considering. Just a flat refusal, delivered with the particular coldness of a man who had already made up his mind before reading the letter. Anna wrote again. This second letter was less measured. She pressed harder. She argued that silence was not neutral, that leaving the field open to émigré propagandists who were already circulating their own versions of Lenin's background was itself a political choice, and a bad one.
She pointed out that the Soviet state had built its legitimacy on the rejection of racial hierarchy, on the principle that a man's worth had nothing to do with his blood. To suppress information about Lenin's heritage was to act, however unintentionally, on the same logic as the anti-Semites, the logic that Jewish ancestry was something to be hidden, something shameful, something that diminished rather than complicated. It was a sharp argument. It was also a losing one. Stalin did not respond to the second letter with words. He responded with action.
The documents Anna had found were classified. Access to the relevant archival materials was restricted. The name Israel Blank was removed from any official account of Lenin's family history. Alexander Blank, the Christian physician, remained. His origins did not. The mechanism was not crude. Stalin did not order the documents burned. He did not have Anna arrested or publicly discredited. She was, after all, Lenin's sister. And that carried its own political weight, even in a state that was rapidly learning to treat sentiment as a liability. What he did was more precise and, in its way, more complete. He ensured that the information could not travel. The documents existed. They sat in their folders, in their boxes, on their shelves. But the people who might have read them, written about them, or spoken about them, understood, with the clarity that Soviet bureaucrats developed as a survival skill, that this was not a subject that rewarded curiosity. Historians who worked on Lenin's biography knew better than to ask certain questions. Archivists who handled the relevant materials knew better than to flag certain files. The silence was not enforced through terror, at least not primarily. It was enforced through the much quieter mechanism of institutional understanding. The shared knowledge, never spoken aloud, that some doors were not to be opened. This is worth pausing on because it tells us something important about how the Soviet state managed inconvenient truths. The instinct of authoritarian systems, as we tend to imagine them, is to destroy, to burn the documents, shoot the witnesses, erase the evidence. And the Soviet state certainly did all of those things, in other contexts, with other secrets. But in this case, the choice was different. The documents were preserved. The secret was not eliminated. It was archived. And that distinction matters. An archive is not a grave. It is a waiting room. The information sits there, patient, indifferent to the political calculations that put it there, indifferent to the careers and ideological structures that depend on its silence. It waits for the moment when the calculation changes. It waited, in this case, for 60 years. The opening came with Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of Glasnost in the late 1980s. In practice, it meant that the Soviet state, for the first time in its history, began to loosen its grip on its own past. Archives that had been sealed for decades were made accessible to researchers. Historians who had spent careers working around the edges of forbidden subjects suddenly found themselves able to ask direct questions and receive direct answers. The Blank family documents were among the materials that surfaced in this period. Soviet and then Russian historians began to publish what Anna Ulyanova had known since the mid-1920s. The name Israel Blank appeared in print, in academic journals, and then in newspapers. The secret that Stalin had guarded for 6 decades dissolved in a matter of months. Not with a bang, not with a political crisis, just with the quiet, slightly anticlimactic revelation that the archive had been there all along, and the archive had been right. What is striking, looking back at the whole arc of this story, is the particular irony at its center. The Soviet state had built its legitimacy on the rejection of the old world, on the promise that the revolution had swept away the hierarchies of blood and class and faith that had defined the Tsarist empire. Lenin himself had been one of the most consistent voices for that rejection. He had argued repeatedly that nationality was a tool of the ruling class, that ethnic identity was a distraction from the real divisions of economic interest, that the revolution belonged to workers of every background and every origin. And yet the state that claimed his legacy spent 60 years hiding the fact that he himself had embodied exactly that complexity. The man who had argued most powerfully that blood did not determine destiny had his own blood carefully managed, curated, and simplified by the people who claimed to speak in his name. Anna had seen the paradox clearly. That was what made her letters to Stalin so pointed and so futile. She was not asking the Soviet state to do something radical. She was asking it to be consistent, to apply to its own founder the principles it claimed to hold. Stalin's refusal was not, at its core, about anti-Semitism, though anti-Semitism was certainly part of the political calculation. It was about something more fundamental. It was about the difference between a man and a myth. A man can be complicated. A man can carry contradictions, unknowns, layers of history he never fully understood. A myth cannot. A myth must be clean. A myth must be legible. A myth must be the kind of thing that can be printed on a poster and understood at a glance. Lenin the man, the Lenin who had filled out a census form in 1922 and written, in the space asking about his paternal grandfather, simply the words, "I do not know," that Lenin was too human for what the party needed. The party needed an icon, and icons do not have complicated grandfathers. Anna Ulyanova lived until 1935. She never saw her letters published. She never saw the name Israel Blank appear in any official account of her brother's family. She died knowing that the truth she had found and the argument she had made had been set aside, not refuted, not disproven, just quietly shelved. But the archive kept her letters too. And when the archive finally opened, historians found not just the genealogical documents, but Anna's own words, her argument, her frustration, her insistence that the truth was worth telling. She had been right about the facts. She had been right about the argument. She had simply been wrong about the moment. The revolution had promised to free people from the chains of the past. What it actually built, in the end, was a state that chained its own founder to a version of himself that had never quite existed. That is the paradox Anna understood and Stalin refused to acknowledge. And it raises a question that the next part of this story makes even harder to answer. How much of Lenin's own past did Lenin himself actually know? The question of what Lenin knew about himself is, in some ways, the most intimate part of this entire story. Not the most dramatic. The drama belongs to Anna's letters, to Stalin's silence, to the 60-year machinery of enforced forgetting. But the most intimate. Because there is something quietly unsettling about the idea of a man who spent his life insisting that history could be understood, that the forces shaping human society could be mapped and analysed and ultimately mastered, and who, when it came to the forces that had shaped him personally, simply did not know. In 1922, 2 years before his death, Lenin filled out a Soviet census form. He was already ill by then. The first stroke had come that May, and the man who had once worked 18-hour days was now rationing his energy carefully, aware that his time was limited and that the political succession he had never properly arranged was becoming urgent. The form asked about his family background. When it came to the question of his paternal grandfather, the grandfather on the Ulyanov side, Lenin wrote 3 words: "I do not know." Not an evasion, not a political calculation, just an honest acknowledgement of a gap. The founder of the Soviet state, the man who had reorganized 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, did not know where his own father's father had come from. A year earlier, filling out a different questionnaire, he had described himself as Russian. Historians who have examined this generally conclude that he meant it in the cultural sense. Russian by language, by formation, by the literature and thought that had shaped him. He had grown up reading Pushkin and Turgenev. He thought in Russian, argued in Russian, and whatever else he was by blood or ancestry, he was Russian in the way that actually mattered to him, which was the way of the mind. But the gap in his knowledge was real, and it was not limited to the paternal line. The story of what Lenin did not know about his maternal line, the Blank family, the line Anna had been investigating, is more complicated and in some ways more poignant. Alexander Blank, Lenin's maternal grandfather, had died in 1870, the same year Lenin was born. Lenin never knew him. He grew up with stories of a grandfather who had been a physician, a man of education and standing, a figure of quiet respectability. The Jewish origins of that grandfather, the name Israel, the family from the western provinces, the conversion that had remade a life, were not part of any story Lenin was ever told, as far as historians have been able to determine. This was not, in all likelihood, a deliberate concealment on the part of his mother, Maria. It was the natural outcome of successful assimilation. Alexander Blank had converted decades before Maria was born. He had built his entire adult life on the far side of that conversion. His children had grown up in a household that was, by every visible measure, Russian and Christian. The past was not hidden from them. It had simply ceased to be present. It had receded the way things recede when no one speaks of them, when the people who remember are gone, when the documents sit in archives that no one thinks to consult. Maria Blank had married Ilya Ulyanov in 1863. She was educated, cultured, fluent in German, fond of music. She knew her father had been a physician. She knew her mother had come from a German family with Swedish roots. She knew the things that families pass down in conversation and memory. She did not know, and almost certainly never knew, that her father had been born Israel. That knowledge had been sealed away before she was old enough to ask. And so Lenin grew up in a household that carried, without knowing it, a history it could not see. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most common human experiences. The sense that the people who came before us made choices and lived lives we can barely imagine. That the forces which shaped us are largely invisible to us. What makes Lenin's case remarkable is not the fact of that invisibility, but the scale of what was invisible, and the particular irony of who he became. There is another layer to this story, one that runs parallel to the Blank family discovery, and is, in its own way, equally striking. In the 1930s, a Soviet writer named Marietta Shaginyan was commissioned to write a biography of Lenin. She was a serious researcher, and she went to the archives with genuine scholarly intent. What she found in the records relating to Lenin's paternal grandmother, on the Ulyanov side, was unexpected. The documents suggested that the grandmother's father had been a Kalmyk. The Kalmyks were a Mongolic Buddhist people, originally from Central Asia, who had settled in the steppe regions around the Lower Volga centuries earlier. By the 19th century, they were a recognized minority within the Russian Empire, distinct in language, religion, and appearance, living largely on the margins of the imperial social order. Shaginyan included this finding in her biography with what appears to have been genuine enthusiasm. She saw it as further evidence of Lenin's remarkable origins. A man who carried within him not just the European strands of Jewish, German, and Swedish ancestry, but also the Asian steppe, the Buddhist world, the nomadic cultures of the East. It was, she argued, living proof of the multinational character of the revolution. The book was banned, the documents were confiscated, the Kalmyk connection disappeared from official accounts of Lenin's family with the same thoroughness that had been applied to the Blank family's Jewish origins. Any complexity, any layer of Lenin's ancestry that did not fit the clean Russian narrative was to be removed. Not debated, not contextualized, removed. What is particularly worth noting is that Anna Ulyanova, in her letters to Stalin, had listed the various national strands she believed ran through her brother's heritage: the Jewish line through the blanks, the German and Swedish lines through his maternal grandmother, what she described as possibly Tatar elements. But she did not mention the Kalmyk connection. Whether she was unaware of it, or whether she had already learned that opening additional fronts in a battle she was already losing was pointless, the records do not make entirely clear. The Kalmyk question carries its own particular weight, one that becomes almost unbearable when you follow it to its conclusion. In 1944, Stalin ordered the deportation of the entire Kalmyk people. The charge was collective collaboration with the German occupiers, a charge applied to whole ethnic groups with the blunt instrument of collective punishment, regardless of individual conduct. More than 100,000 Kalmyks were loaded onto freight trains and sent to Siberia and Central Asia. The Kalmyk Autonomous Republic was dissolved. Its name was removed from maps. Its existence was, for a decade, officially erased. The people from whom Lenin may, by one line of descent, have been partly descended, the people whose blood may have run, however distantly, in the veins of the Soviet state's founder, were deported by the man who had spent 20 years carefully managing that founder's image. Whether Stalin knew of Shaginyan's research when he signed the deportation order, whether the irony registered at any level, is not something the archives reveal. Perhaps it was simply the collision of two separate threads of Soviet history that happened to intersect in a way no one involved was in a position to acknowledge. Or perhaps it is exactly the kind of detail that history produces when it is being honest with itself, too pointed to be comfortable, too well documented to be dismissed. What all of this adds up to is a portrait of a man whose actual origins were far more layered, far more complex, and far more interesting than the icon the Soviet state was building. Lenin himself, writing "I do not know" on his census form in 1922, was being more honest about his own history than the state that claimed his legacy would be for the next 6 decades. He did not know, and in not knowing, he was, in a strange way, more truthful than the myth that replaced him. The question this raises, and that the next part of this story begins to answer, is what that history actually looked like when you trace it back. Not the myth, not the icon, not the carefully managed image, the actual history. The people who came before Lenin, the choices they made, the worlds they moved through. Because the complexity the Soviet state worked so hard to suppress was not an accident. It was the product of generations of movement, conversion, reinvention, and survival. And to understand it, you have to go back much further than 1924. You have to go back to a serf without a surname, standing at the edge of a world that was about to change. The serf had no surname. That is where this part of the story begins, not with a revolutionary, not with a political crisis, not with a letter to Stalin, but with a man whose entire existence was recorded in someone else's documents. His name was Vasily. He belonged to a landowner named Brekhov, somewhere in the central Russian provinces in the early decades of the 19th century. He had no legal identity of his own, no property, no right of movement, no claim on his own labor. In the language of the empire that owned him, he was a soul, and souls were counted, taxed, and transferred like livestock. What Vasily thought about his situation, what he wanted, what he feared, the archive does not say. The archive was not interested in what serfs thought. It was interested in what they were worth. But Vasily had a son, and that son would begin a journey that, across 3 generations, would produce one of the most consequential figures in modern history. The son's name was Nikolai. How exactly Nikolai obtained his freedom is not entirely clear from the surviving records. The mechanisms of serf emancipation before the Great Reform of 1861 were varied and often informal. Payments of tribute, quiet arrangements with landowners, the kind of negotiation that left few clean traces in official paperwork. What is clear is that at some point in the early 19th century, Nikolai made his way to Astrakhan. This matters more than it might seem. Astrakhan was not a typical Russian provincial town. It sat at the mouth of the Volga, where the river finally met the Caspian Sea, and it had been for centuries a place where the boundaries of empire blurred. Tartars, Armenians, Persians, Kalmyks, Russians, and a dozen other peoples moved through its markets and lived in its neighbourhoods. It was a trading city, a border city, a place where identity was more fluid than in the settled heartland of Russia, where what you could do mattered more than what you had been born. For a man trying to build a life from nothing, it was, in its way, an ideal destination. In Astrakhan, Nikolai did something quietly significant. He changed his name. The shift from Ulyanin to Ulyanov was small, a single letter, a slight smoothing of the ending, but the meaning was not in the phonetics, it was in the act itself. A serf did not choose his name. A serf inherited a designation attached to him by the world that owned him. To change that label, even slightly, was to assert something. It was to say, I am not only what I was born, I am also what I decide to be. In Astrakhan, Nikolai also married. His wife was Anna Smirnova, and her father, according to documents that the researcher Marietta Shaginyan would later uncover in the 1930s, had been a Kalmyk before his conversion to Orthodox Christianity. The Kalmyks were a Mongolic Buddhist people who had migrated westward from Central Asia centuries earlier and settled in the steppe lands around the lower Volga. By the 19th century, they were a recognized part of the empire's ethnic mosaic, distinct in appearance, language, and religious practice, living largely outside the social structures that defined Russian provincial life. What this marriage meant to Nikolai and Anna in their daily lives, whether the Kalmyk heritage of Anna's father was something spoken of or simply absorbed into the texture of a mixed-culture city, the records do not say. What it produced in the next generation was a child who carried within him the blood of a freed serf, a Kalmyk convert, and whatever else Astrakhan had contributed to the family's story. That child was Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, and Ilya is where the story shifts from survival to ambition. Ilya was born in 1831, the second son of Nikolai and Anna. The family was not wealthy. They had no patrons, no land, no inherited position. What they had was the particular hunger of people who had recently escaped the bottom of a social order and understood, with the clarity that comes from proximity, exactly how precarious their position remained. Ilya's older brother Vasily, named perhaps for the grandfather who had been a serf, made a decision that would change the family's trajectory. He worked, saved, and paid for Ilya's education. This was not a small thing. Education in the Russian Empire was not free, not universal, and not equally accessible. For a family of Ilya's background, sending a son to university required sacrifice of a kind the records do not fully capture, but that the logic of the situation makes plain. Vasily gave up something so that Ilya could have something. Ilya went to Kazan University. He studied mathematics and physics. He graduated, became a teacher, and then rose steadily through the educational bureaucracy of Simbirsk province, the same province where, years later, his son Vladimir would be born. By the peak of his career, Ilya held the position of director of people's schools for the Simbirsk region, responsible for expanding primary education across a vast rural territory. He was, by any measure, a remarkable man. He had taken the raw material of his father's freedom and his brother's sacrifice and built from it a life of genuine public service. He believed in education the way some men believe in God, as the force that could lift people out of poverty and ignorance, that could make the empire better from within, one schoolroom at a time. For his service, the empire rewarded him. He was granted the rank of actual state councillor, a civil grade that carried, under the laws of the Russian Empire, a specific and significant consequence. It conferred hereditary nobility. The son of a freed serf, the grandson of a man who had been counted among someone else's property, had risen to a rank that made his children nobles by birth. When Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born in 1870, he was born a nobleman. Not a wealthy one, not a powerful one, but a nobleman nonetheless, with the legal status the title carried. The revolution's future architect entered the world with the papers of the class he would spend his life trying to destroy. Ilya died in January of 1886. He was 54 years old. He had spent his career building schools, training teachers, expanding literacy in a province where most people still lived in conditions not dramatically different from those his own father had escaped. He died believing, or at least hoping, that the system could be improved from within, that patient, dedicated work inside the structures of the empire could make it more just, more capable of serving the people it governed. He did not live to see what happened next. 13 months after Ilya's death, his eldest son Alexander was arrested in St. Petersburg. Alexander Ulyanov was 21 years old, a brilliant student of natural sciences and a member of a revolutionary cell that had been planning to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out. Alexander was tried, convicted, and hanged in May of 1887. He went to the scaffold with a composure that the guards reportedly found unsettling. He had been offered the chance to appeal for clemency. He declined. The second son, Vladimir, was 16 when his brother was executed. He was preparing for his final school examinations in Simbirsk. The director of his school, a man named Fyodor Kerensky, whose own son, Alexander, would one day lead the provisional government that Lenin would overthrow, wrote a glowing reference for Vladimir's university application, describing him as a young man of exceptional ability and serious character. Vladimir received his gold medal. He went to Kazan University, the same institution where his father had studied. He was expelled within months for participating in a student demonstration. He never looked back. What the three-generation arc of the Ulyanov family reveals, when you lay it out in sequence, is something that feels almost too precise to be accidental. Though of course it was entirely accidental, the product of individual choices made by people who could not see where the line was going. A serf without a surname, a freedman who chose his own name, and married in a border city where origins mattered less than capability. A son who rose through the imperial system to its lower nobility, who built schools and believed in reform, who died before the world he had worked within began to crack. And then a grandson who looked at everything his grandfather had built. The rank, the respectability, the patient faith in incremental improvement, and concluded that the entire structure needed to come down. The formula is almost classical in its shape. The first generation escapes, the second generation rises, the third generation inherits enough security to ask dangerous questions. The fourth generation burns the house down. But there is something the clean formula tends to obscure. Ilya Ulyanov had not just risen through the system, he had believed in it. He had given it his best years and his genuine faith that education could be the lever that moved the world towards something better. His son, Alexander, had looked at the same system and decided that the only honest response was a bomb. His son, Vladimir, had looked at both of them, at his father's patient service and his brother's violent sacrifice, and built something more systematic than either: a theory, a party, a revolution. The question of which of them was right is one that the 20th century spent 100 years trying to answer, with results that are still being debated. But the question of where Vladimir Ulyanov came from, the actual human material, the generations of movement and reinvention and aspiration that produced him, that question has a clearer answer. He came from a serf who had no name of his own. He came from a border city where identities were negotiable. He came from a man who believed the empire could be improved, and a brother who believed it had to be destroyed. He came from a family that had climbed, in 3 generations, from the bottom of the social order to its lower reaches, and had found, at that altitude, not satisfaction, but a clearer view of how far there still was to go. That is the Ulyanov line. But it is only half of the story, because while Nikolai was making his way to Astrakhan, and while Ilya was rising through the schools of Simbirsk, something equally complicated was unfolding on the other side of the family. In the western provinces of the empire, in the world of the Pale of Settlement, a man named Moisey Blank was making his own calculations about survival, identity, and the price of belonging to a world that did not want you. And the choices he made would travel, through his son and his granddaughter, all the way to the man who would one day stand before a crowd in Petrograd and announce that history was about to change. Moisey Blank was not a man who made himself easy to like. The records that survive from his life in the western provinces of the Russian Empire paint a portrait of someone sharp, restless, and constitutionally unsuited to the quiet endurance that the Pale of Settlement demanded of its inhabitants. He was born in the second half of the 18th century in Volhynia, a region of flat agricultural land and small Jewish towns in what is now northwestern Ukraine, then part of the empire's western borderlands. He traded in alcohol and lent money at interest. He was, by the standards of his community, a man of some means and considerable friction. What made Moisey Blank historically significant was not his business dealings, but his relationship with authority. In a world where the Jewish community functioned as a collective shield, where disputes were settled internally and the outside world was kept at arm's length as a matter of survival, Moisey did something his neighbors regarded as a form of betrayal. He went to the Tsarist authorities, more than once. The details of these disputes are fragmentary, and historians working with the available records have been careful to note that the full picture is not recoverable. What is clear is that Moisey was willing to use the imperial legal system against members of his own community, to appeal to the very power that circumscribed Jewish life in the empire, rather than work through the internal structures the community had built precisely to avoid that kind of exposure. In a world where the state was understood as a threat to be managed rather than a resource to be used, this was not merely unconventional. It was a rupture. The documentary record also contains references to a fire and to suspicions that followed Moisey in its wake. The archives do not provide enough detail to reconstruct what actually happened, and it would be wrong to present speculation as fact. What is documented is that at some point Moisey relocated to Zhytomyr, a larger town further east, where he established a money-lending operation and continued the pattern of a man who moved through the world on his own terms, regardless of the cost to his standing. In 1834, Moisey Blank converted to Orthodox Christianity. He was already in his 50s or 60s, an old man by the standards of the era, making a decision that younger men typically made when they were still building their lives. He took the name Dmitri. His sons converted alongside him. The conversion gave them legal rights that Jews in the empire did not possess: the right to live outside the Pale, to own certain kinds of property, to move more freely through the social structures of Imperial Russia. It was, whatever else it was, a practical calculation. But Moisey did not stop there. In 1846, he wrote a letter to Tsar Nicholas I. The letter has been examined by historians, and its contents are documented. In it, Moisey Blank made a series of proposals regarding the Jewish population of the empire. He suggested that Jews should be prohibited from wearing traditional clothing. He proposed that synagogue services should include prayers for the Tsar. He argued, more broadly, for systematic pressure on the external markers of Jewish identity, the visible signs that distinguish the community from the surrounding population, as a means of accelerating assimilation. Some of what he proposed found its way in one form or another into subsequent imperial policy. The letter was not ignored. It is difficult to know what to make of Moisey Blank at this distance. He had converted under pressure, used the imperial system against his own community, and then proposed that the state use that same system to dissolve the community entirely. The logic of the extreme assimilationist taken to its end point. But the world he inhabited was one of genuine and brutal constraint, and the choices available to people living within the pale of settlement were not the choices available to people looking back at them from a comfortable distance. What is clear is that Moisey Blank had decided, with a thoroughness that went beyond mere survival, to become something other than what he had been born. His son took a different path. The son, born Israel Moiseyevich Blank, converted alongside his father and took the name Alexander Dmitrievich Blank. Where Moisey's conversion had been the act of an older man remaking himself late in life, Alexander's was the foundation of an entirely new identity built from the beginning of his adult years. He was young enough when he converted that the life he constructed afterward had no visible seam, no obvious point where the old self ended and the new one began. What is documented is that Alexander gained access to the Medico-Surgical Academy in St. Petersburg, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the empire. The records indicate that he carried a letter of recommendation from a senator named Baranov. How Alexander Blank came to have the support of a senator, what the connection was, how it was established, is something the surviving documents do not explain. It is one of those gaps in the archive that invites speculation but resists certainty. What is not in dispute is that Alexander completed his medical training, qualified as a physician, and built a career that took him eventually to the Ural region, where he worked as a doctor and retired to a small estate. He was, by all accounts, a competent and respected practitioner. He married Anna Groschopf, a woman of German and Swedish descent, Protestant by background, from the educated Baltic world that had long been integrated into the upper professional classes of the empire. Their children would grow up in a household where German was spoken alongside Russian, where the cultural references were as likely to be Goethe as Pushkin, where the family's identity was defined by education and professional standing, with no visible connection to Volhynia, to the Pale of Settlement, or to a man named Moisey. Alexander Blank did not tell his children about his origins. There is no letter, no diary entry, no recorded conversation in which he explains his silence. It is simply the absence of evidence that he ever spoke of it, combined with the evidence that his children grew up with no apparent knowledge of their father's background. The assimilation had been complete enough that the past did not need to be actively hidden. It had simply ceased to be present. Maria Alexandrovna Blank was the youngest of Alexander's daughters. She was born in 1835 and grew up in a household shaped by her father's professional world and her mother's German cultural inheritance. She spoke German fluently, read widely, played the piano. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her, a woman of considerable intelligence and quiet strength, qualities that would matter enormously in the years ahead, when she would raise a family through political catastrophe and personal grief. In 1863, Maria Blank married Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov. The two families that had been moving on entirely separate trajectories, the Ulyanovs rising from serfdom through the educational bureaucracy of Simbirsk, the Blanks moving from the Pale of Settlement through conversion and medicine into the professional classes of the empire, came together in a single household. Neither family, as far as the records suggest, had any clear picture of the other's full history. Ilya knew that his wife came from a doctor's family, that she was educated and cultured, that her mother had been German. He did not know, and almost certainly never knew, that his father-in-law had been born Israel, that his wife's grandfather had written letters to the Tsar proposing the forced assimilation of the Jewish community. Maria knew that her husband had come from Astrakhan, that his father had been a craftsman, that Ilya had risen through education and hard work. She did not know that her husband's grandmother had been the daughter of a Kalmyk convert, that the border city of Astrakhan had contributed its own layer of complexity to the family she was joining. They were, in this sense, two people who knew each other well and knew their shared history not at all. In 1870, in the provincial city of Simbirsk on the Volga, their fourth child was born. They named him Vladimir. He would grow up in a household that was, on the surface, entirely legible. The family of a respected educational official, cultured, serious, committed to learning. He would absorb his mother's German discipline and his father's faith in the transformative power of education. He would not know about Volhynia. He would not know about Moisey Blank's letter to the Tsar. He would not know that the grandfather he had never met had been born with a different name in a different world. And yet the question the final part of this story cannot avoid is whether any of it mattered, whether the invisible layers of history assembled in this one man had any bearing on who he became. The world Moisey Blank had tried so desperately to escape, the world of legal exclusion, of identity as a cage, of the state as an instrument of classification and control, was precisely the world that his great-grandson would spend his life trying to dismantle. Whether that was coincidence or something more is the question we are about to answer. Maria Alexandrovna Ulyanova never knew what she carried. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating fact in this entire story. She was a careful woman, an attentive mother, someone who kept the household running through illness and grief and political catastrophe with a steadiness that people who knew her consistently remarked upon. She read to her children in German and Russian. She made sure they practiced their music. She outlived her husband, outlived two of her sons, one hanged by the state, one destroyed by it in a different way, and she did all of this without ever knowing that the world her father had fled, the world of the Pale of Settlement, the world of legal exclusion and enforced identity, was the same world her son would spend his life trying to tear apart. The connection was invisible. It had been made invisible deliberately across 2 generations by men who understood that in the Russian Empire certain origins were not assets to be acknowledged, but liabilities to be managed. And yet the connection was there, not as destiny, not as some mystical transmission of purpose through blood. History does not work that way, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something, but as context, as the accumulated weight of choices made by people who had no idea their choices would matter to anyone beyond themselves. Moisey Blank in Volhynia, calculating the price of belonging to a community the empire wanted to erase. His son Israel, reborn as Alexander, building a life on the far side of a conversion that closed one door and opened another. Maria, growing up in a doctor's house with German books and a piano, carrying a history she had never been given. Nikolai Ulyanov in Astrakhan, choosing a name for himself because no one had given him one worth keeping. Ilya, rising through the schools of Simbirsk on his brother's sacrifice and his own relentless work, dying before he could see what his family would become. All of them moving forward, none of them looking back. Each one handing to the next generation a world slightly different from the one they had inherited. And then Vladimir. What do we actually make of all this? The honest answer is that we should be careful. The temptation, when you lay out a genealogy this layered, is to read it as explanation, to say that Lenin became who he was because of where he came from, that the revolutionary was somehow encoded in the ancestry. That is too clean. Lenin was shaped by his reading, by his brother's execution, by the particular texture of late Tsarist Russia, by the intellectual currents of his time, by choices he made as a conscious adult. The genealogy does not explain him, but it does illuminate something. Consider what the people in this story had in common. Moisey had lived inside a system that classified him by birth and used that classification to limit what he could do and where he could go. He had responded by trying to use the system against itself, and then by trying to escape the classification entirely. His son Alexander had gone further. He had rebuilt himself so completely that the classification ceased to exist, at least in any practical sense. Nikolai Ulyanov had been born without legal personhood. A soul counted in someone else's ledger, and had walked away from that and given himself a name. Ilya had taken that name and turned it into something the empire was forced to recognize: a rank, a title, a place in the official order. Each of these people had, in their own way, confronted the same fundamental problem: the problem of a world that assigns you an identity and then uses that identity to determine your fate. Each of them had found a different way to push back against that assignment. Lenin's response was the most radical of all. He did not try to escape the system of classification. He did not try to rise within it. He tried to abolish it. The argument that nationality was a bourgeois construct, that ethnic identity was a tool of the ruling class, that the revolution belonged to workers regardless of their origin. These were not abstract philosophical positions. They were, at some level, the logical endpoint of everything his family had been doing for 3 generations. The serf who chose his own name, the convert who built a new life, the teacher who believed education could dissolve the barriers of birth, and finally, the man who said, "The barriers themselves have to go." Whether he was right is a question the 20th century answered with a complexity that resists any simple verdict. The Soviet state that claimed his legacy produced genuine advances in literacy, in public health, in the material conditions of people who had lived in poverty for generations. It also produced the Gulag, the show trials, the deliberate famines, the deportations, including, with a historical irony almost too sharp to be accidental, the deportation of the Kalmyk people in 1944, the very people from whom Lenin may, by one line of descent, have been partly descended. Stalin, who had spent 20 years carefully managing Lenin's image, who had suppressed Anna's letters and sealed the archives and ensured that the name Israel Blank would not appear in any official account of the Soviet founder's family, was himself a Georgian ruling a predominantly Slavic state. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the political uses of ethnic identity and the political dangers of complexity. He built a myth of Lenin precisely because myths are controllable in ways that human beings are not. A myth does not have a grandfather who converted. A myth does not write, "I do not know," on a census form. A myth does not carry, in its own body, the evidence that the categories it claims to transcend were never as fixed as the people enforcing them pretended. Anna Ulyanova had understood all of this. Her letters to Stalin were not naive. They were the argument of someone who had grasped, with unusual clarity, that the truth of Lenin's origins was not a threat to his legacy, but the most powerful possible illustration of it. A man who carried Jewish, German, Swedish, Russian, and possibly Kalmyk ancestry, who had never known most of it, who had arrived at his internationalism not through sentiment, but through rigorous analysis. That man was a more compelling symbol of what the revolution claimed to be than any sanitized icon could ever be. Stalin chose the icon anyway. He chose it because icons are useful and human beings are not. He chose it because the Soviet state, for all its revolutionary rhetoric, had inherited from the empire it replaced a deep instinct for the management of identity, the sense that people needed to be legible, classifiable, assignable to categories that the state could understand and control. Lenin the man, with his complicated genealogy and his honest ignorance of his own origins, was not legible in that way. Lenin the icon was. The archive, in the end, proved more durable than the icon. When Gorbachev's Glasnost opened the sealed rooms of Soviet history in the late 1980s, the documents Anna had found 60 years earlier were still there. The name Israel Blank was still there. Her letters were still there, making the same argument she had made in the 1920s. Still sharp, still right, still unanswered in any official sense. History had simply waited. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The Soviet state, at the height of its power, with all the instruments of censorship and institutional control at its disposal, could not make the truth disappear. It could only delay it. The archive is patient in a way that states are not. It does not have a career to protect or a political position to maintain. It simply holds what it holds and waits for the moment when someone is finally allowed to look. What the archive held, in this case, was the story of a family that had crossed the entire social landscape of the Russian Empire in 4 generations, from a serf's hut to a revolutionary's study, from the Pale of Settlement to the Kremlin, from people who had no legal existence to a man who rewrote the legal existence of 1/6 of the world. None of them planned it. None of them could have imagined it. Each of them simply made the choices available to them in the world as they found it and handed the consequences forward to people they would never meet. That is how history actually works most of the time. Not through the grand designs of exceptional individuals, but through the accumulation of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people trying to survive, to rise, to give their children something better than what they had. The exceptional individual, when he appears, is usually the product of that accumulation. The point where enough pressure, enough aspiration, enough unresolved tension finally finds a form. Vladimir Ulyanov was that point. He was the place where a freed serf's ambition and a convert's reinvention and a teacher's faith and a mother's quiet discipline all converged in a particular historical moment and produced something none of them had intended and all of them had, in some sense, made possible. The Soviet state tried to simplify that into an icon. The icon served its purpose for a while, but the man was always more interesting than the icon. He was more interesting because he was real, because he carried in himself the evidence of everything the revolution claimed to be fighting for and everything it would eventually betray. The complexity the state suppressed was not incidental to Lenin's story. It was the story. Anna chose the truth. Stalin chose the myth. For 60 years, history chose Stalin. But the archive kept Anna's letters. And archives, in the end, always speak. If this kind of history, the kind that goes beneath the official version, that follows the documents into the places the powerful would rather you not look, is something you want more of, then subscribe. Every video we make is built on the same principle. The real story is almost always stranger, richer, and more human than the myth. And if something in this video surprised you, or changed how you think about Lenin, or raised a question we did not answer, tell us in the comments. We read them, we argue about them. Sometimes they change what we make next. The archive is always open.